Good morning everybody and welcome back to the channel Airbus What's It Doing Now. I wanted to share with you a quick video on fuel leak on engine start. It's something that you might experience in very cold weathers that we're experiencing or have experienced quite recently. Those of you that are operating in Eastern Europe at sub-zero temperatures may well have experienced this before. And it was an event which occurred to me quite recently, which just reminded me that in cold weather operations we might see this. So I thought I wanted to share with you just to remind you of your own company procedures and what to do in the event of. Now, one thing that we have to be very careful of here is that different companies operate in different procedures. Obviously, maintenance will be under Airbus, but in terms of your SOPs, they may differ. So I just want to bring to your attention that your company SOPs take preference over any of the videos that you might see on this channel. That's a very important take home, because every company will operate slightly differently. Largely, I propose in line with Airbus. But there will be differences. So with regards to fuel leak then, this is a phenomenon which can happen on a very cold engine, particularly if it's been left overnight and the engine has been cold soaked, if you like. And what happens is the seals around the engine, the fuel seals in particular, can become quite rigid. And on engine start, when fuel flows into the engine, those seals don't seal properly, and then a fuel leak can be observed from the drain mast there, or sometimes further after the engine, depending on where the fuel leak is coming from or which element of the fuel system is responsible. Now, one thing I have to say also is that at this time of year, during cold weather operations, it's very probable that your aircraft may have been preventative de-iced. What I mean by that is that sometime during the early hours of the morning, before you report to the aircraft, that a de-icing fluid would have been applied to prevent any formation of frost. We have to be very careful here, because when the ground crew are watching the engine, just to make sure that what they are observing isn't actually de-icing fluid which is dripping from the engine. Now, the experienced ground crew should be able to recognise the difference between the two, but worthy of note there. And this is something that you might want to bring up in the briefing as a crew, and maybe even with your cabin crew. So the thing to look out for then at the engine start, if these seals aren't sealing properly, it's quite probable that without them sealing correctly, there may be a fuel leak. Now, it's going to be relatively small, and your operations manual may actually give you some guidance on what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. But certainly the master MEL, which your engineering department will obviously have access to, will be able to let you know whether the aircraft is dispatchable. Now, in my experience, when this happened, we pushed back and the ground crew immediately notified me that there was fuel leaking from the bottom of the engine. They hadn't seen this during the push, but as soon as we started the engine, it then started to leak. They recognised this as a continual flow, not sort of drops of de-icing, which they would have experienced other times during the push. This was a continual leak then from the drain mast, and it wasn't dripping, it was a continual leak. Now, the recommendation from our operations manual is to run the engine for about 5 minutes. That'll heat the engine up, allow the heat to be absorbed by all the parts, including the fuel seals. They then become more rubberized and more elastic, and they're then better to perform their job. And the hope then is that the fuel leak will stop. Now, in our case, we ran the engine for 5 minutes and it didn't stop, it continued, and there was no reduction in that rate. After 5 minutes then, we then shut the engine down and we spoke to our maintenance control. We'd push back off the stand at this point. And the recommendation was to run the engine again for to let the engine not cool down, but radiate its heat for 5 minutes. So after shutdown, let it radiate its heat for 5 minutes and then start again. We then duly did that, and we had the leak continue, at which point then we came on back onto stand. Once we were on stand, the engineers then attended the aircraft, had a good look around, and the recommendation then was to start the engine a third time to see if the leak continued, and at which point then, if it did, then the likelihood is that we would then ground the aircraft. Now, the outside temperature was -6 at the time, and it had been single digits between -6 and -8 for most of the evening. So it's a particularly cold night. Now, I have seen this before, and after the second start it clears up, or even during the first start when the heat radiates, it usually stops. But in this case, obviously, it didn't. We then started the engine the third time with the engineers monitoring the engine, and then it cleared up. No more leak, and the aircraft was dispatched. So just some take-homes here, that during cold weather, this is a phenomenon which can happen. It's worth talking to your ground crew. It's also worth looking through the history of the tech log to see if an engine or the aircraft had experienced this in the past. And also from a management point of view, when we're managing communication between each other and with ATC and with passengers and the cabin crew. Certainly for commanders out there and new commanders that may have experienced this for the first time, it's going to take a little bit of careful management. Mentioning fuel leak to passengers is going to send the wrong message. A technical issue would probably be more appropriate, so that we don't scare anybody unnecessarily. But that's going to take a little bit of careful management, particularly after you've pushed back and you've shut an engine down and you've restarted an engine. Keeping the plate spinning and keeping people involved and the various parties involved is a very important part of this exercise. The actual fuel leak itself is pretty straightforward. It's either going to stop or it's not. If it stops, you go. If it doesn't stop, chances are you're probably not going to go. But one of the other take-homes I took from this in my experience was the recommendation for the engineer to shut the engine down for 5 minutes, let the heat radiate into those seals, and then start the engine again before going back onto stand. And I thought that was very useful. It didn't work in our case, but by the third engine start it did. Now, I'm not suggesting you sit there and keep trying to restart the engine, but it might be worth thinking before you pull on to stand, just shutting down, letting ATC know, starting the engine again, and then seeing if you have any more success before pulling the aircraft back onto stand. Of course, you've got your maintenance control that are going to be there to help you and are at hand to guide you through this process. And they're, of course, always going to be there if you're unsure or if you're not at base and you're down route somewhere. I suspect this probably won't be as likely to happen down route because the engines would have been through a heat cycle at that point and everything should have bedded in and settled quite nicely. So just in closing then, be careful of cold weather operations and cold temperatures with the fact that you may observe a fuel leak. The procedure with that is going to be written into your manual. It may help if you cycle the engine through a second time, a second heat cycle. That may clear itself up. Do be careful with de-icing fluid, not confusing de-icing fluid with fuel. Have your ground crew monitor the engine, particularly if there has been some history of fuel leaks in the past. And for commanders out there, remember to keep everybody involved and up to date with the process. Be careful what you say to the passengers so as not to alert them unnecessarily, and to keep everybody informed to make your life and their lives a lot easier. Hope that helps. A happy new year to everybody as well, which I forgot to mention earlier on. Hope it's proving to be good for you so far on only 23. Keep safe, keep the plate spinning. I'll talk to you again on another episode in the near future. Thanks very much indeed. Bye for now.